August 19, 1942. The beaches of Dieppe, France, are supposed to be the site of a triumphant Allied raid, a demonstration that Hitler's fortress Europe can be breached. Instead, they become a slaughter. Canadian troops storm ashore under withering German fire. Tanks are supposed to support the assault, providing armored firepower to suppress defensive positions. The tanks arrive aboard conventional landing craft, lowered from larger ships offshore. Some bog down in the beach stones, their tracks unable to gain purchase. Others are disabled by German anti-tank guns before they can advance inland. The few that make it off the beach are isolated, unsupported, and quickly destroyed or abandoned. By the end of the day, over 3,000 Canadian soldiers are dead, wounded, or captured. 28 tanks have been lost. The raid is a catastrophic failure, but it teaches a critical lesson. You cannot invade a defended coastline unless you can land armor directly on the beach in overwhelming numbers, and you cannot do that with conventional ships. The Allies needed a vessel that did not exist. A ship that could cross oceans carrying dozens of tanks, drive directly onto a beach, and disgorge its cargo without using cranes or landing craft. The ship would need to have a flat bottom to beach itself. It would need bow doors that could open and a ramp that could drop directly onto sand or stone. It would need to carry enough cargo to make the trip worthwhile and enough defensive armament to survive the approach. It would need to be cheap and simple enough to build by the hundreds. The concept was called a landing ship tank, or LST. The Royal Navy had experimented with similar designs before the war, but nothing approaching the scale needed for a major amphibious invasion. In late 1941, Winston Churchill himself sent a memo demanding the development of ships capable of landing tanks directly on beaches. The specifications he outlined were clear. The ship must carry heavy tanks, not just light vehicles. It must cross the Atlantic under its own power. It must have a shallow enough draft to beach on typical European coastlines, and it must be built quickly in large numbers. British designers created an initial proposal, but British shipyards were already overwhelmed with warship construction. The task fell to American shipbuilders who had the industrial capacity to produce the vessels in the quantities needed. The problem was that the design requirements were contradictory. Ships designed to cross oceans have deep drafts and rounded hulls that cut efficiently through waves. Ships designed to beach themselves have flat bottoms and shallow drafts. Combining both requirements meant creating a vessel that would be a terrible ocean-going ship and a marginally adequate beaching craft. The LST would be neither fish nor fowl, a compromise that sacrificed elegance and seaworthiness for pure functionality. The final design measured 100 meters in length with a beam of 15 meters. Displacement was over 4,000 tons fully loaded. The hull was flat-bottomed for most of its length, giving a loaded draft of just under 4 meters. This shallow draft was critical for beaching, but made the ship behave abominably in rough seas. LST crews would joke that their vessels could roll on wet grass. The flat bottom caught every wave broadside, causing violent rolling that made seasickness nearly universal among crews. The bow section was the revolutionary element. Large clamshell doors could swing open, revealing a ramp that lowered onto the beach. Tanks could drive directly from the tank deck, through the bow doors, down the ramp, and onto enemy territory. The tank deck ran nearly the entire length of the ship and could accommodate 20 to 30 Sherman tanks, depending on configuration, or up to 60 vehicles if trucks and lighter equipment were carried. A second deck above could carry smaller vehicles or supplies. The total cargo capacity exceeded 2,000 tons, making the LST one of the largest cargo vessels built primarily for one-way trips to hostile beaches. Propulsion was provided by 2 diesel engines driving twin screws. Top speed was about 12 knots, barely adequate to keep up with convoys, but sufficient for the vessel's intended role. The LST was never meant to outrun anything. It was meant to beach, unload, retract, and return for another load. Defensive armament varied, but typically included several 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Some LSTs mounted additional weapons and served as fire support vessels during beach assaults. The crew complement was approximately 100 officers and men, though this could swell to over 200 when Army personnel and passengers were embarked. Living conditions were cramped and uncomfortable. The flat-bottomed hull made the ship noisy and prone to vibration. The smell of diesel fuel permeated everything. The constant rolling in even moderate seas made rest difficult. LST service was not glamorous, but it was essential. The engineering challenges of the LST design were substantial. The flat bottom that allowed beaching made the hull structurally weak compared to conventional ships. Reinforcement was needed throughout the structure to prevent the hull from flexing and cracking under the stress of beaching and retracting. The bow doors had to be watertight when closed to allow ocean crossing, but they represented a fundamental weak point in the hull. If the doors failed at sea, the entire tank deck would flood and the ship would likely sink. The seal was maintained by rubber gaskets and mechanical dogs that secured the doors closed. Crew members checked these seals obsessively during ocean crossings. The beaching and retracting procedure required careful management of ballast. The LST carried ballast tanks throughout the hull that could be flooded or pumped to adjust draft. On approach to a beach, ballast tanks would be full, giving maximum draft and stability. Once beached, the forward tanks would be pumped out, lifting the bow slightly and ensuring the ramp would seat firmly on the beach. After unloading, aft tanks would be flooded to lift the bow off the beach, and the ship would reverse engines to pull itself back into deeper water. The procedure took practice and skill. A poorly executed beaching could leave an LST stuck on a beach, vulnerable to artillery fire and impossible to retract. The tank deck posed its own challenges. Tanks had to be loaded in specific order and secured properly to prevent shifting during transit. A tank breaking loose during rough seas could cause catastrophic damage, crushing men and equipment and potentially holing the hull. Securing heavy vehicles on a constantly rolling deck required experience and attention to detail. The load had to be balanced to maintain proper trim. Too much weight forward and the ship would plow through waves rather than riding over them. Too much weight aft and steering became difficult. Load planning for an LST was a complex calculation involving weight, distribution, and the order in which vehicles needed to discharge. The most urgently needed equipment had to be positioned to exit first. The ventilation in the tank deck was marginal at best. When loaded with running vehicles, the deck filled with exhaust fumes that could reach lethal concentrations. Crews learned to keep vehicles shut down until the last possible moment and to ventilate thoroughly before personnel entered the space. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a constant danger. Production of LSTs began in late 1942 at shipyards across the United States. The design was deliberately simplified to allow construction by yards with limited experience building military vessels. Sections were prefabricated and welded together, using techniques that would later influence post-war commercial shipbuilding. At peak production, American yards were completing LSTs at a rate of several per week. British yards contributed additional vessels. By war's end, over 1,000 LSTs had been built, representing millions of tons of shipping capacity dedicated to the single mission of landing tanks on beaches. The urgency of production meant that early vessels had numerous problems that were corrected in later versions. Early LSTs had inadequate ventilation, poor crew quarters, and structural weaknesses that were only discovered through operational use. Modifications were incorporated as production continued, and ships already in service were often retrofitted during maintenance periods. The LST was never a finished design, but rather an evolving platform that improved throughout the war. Training LST crews required teaching skills that conventional naval training did not cover. Beaching maneuvers had to be practiced until they became second nature. Damage control procedures focused on the unique vulnerabilities of the flat-bottomed hull and bow doors. Navigation required careful attention to tides and beach conditions. Loading and unloading procedures had to be coordinated with Army personnel who would drive the vehicles. The LST was as much a logistics platform as a naval vessel, and successful operations required cooperation between Navy and Army personnel, who often had very different operational cultures. The most experienced LST captains could beach their vessels with precision, placing the bow exactly where needed despite strong currents and enemy fire. The ability to judge tide, current, wind, and beach conditions separated competent LST officers from exceptional ones, and the difference could mean success or disaster during combat landings. The LST's combat debut came during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Over 200 LSTs participated, landing armor directly on Sicilian beaches and proving the concept viable. The landings were not perfect. Some LSTs broached in heavy surf, stranding themselves sideways on beaches. Others took fire from German positions and suffered casualties. But the overall operation succeeded, and armor reached the beaches in sufficient quantity to support the infantry assault. The lessons learned in Sicily were applied to subsequent operations in Italy, where LSTs played critical roles in the Salerno and Anzio landings. By the time planning for the Normandy invasion began, the LST was established as the primary means of landing heavy equipment on defended beaches. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 200 LSTs participated in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The ships crossed the English Channel in convoy, carrying the tanks, trucks, artillery, and supplies that Allied forces would need to establish a beachhead in France. German defenders at Normandy had prepared extensive obstacles, including beach mines, underwater obstacles, and fortified positions. LSTs approached through this gauntlet under fire, beached on the narrow tidal flats, and began disgorging vehicles. The conditions were chaotic. Tides on the Normandy coast have extreme ranges, and timing the landings to coincide with optimal water levels was critical. Some LSTs beached successfully and unloaded without incident. Others struck underwater obstacles or took fire from German artillery. LST 329 was hit by shore batteries and caught fire, but managed to beach and unload her cargo before being abandoned. LST 531 struck a mine and sank with heavy loss of life. Despite casualties, the LSTs delivered thousands of vehicles to the beaches in the first hours of the invasion, providing the armored support that allowed Allied forces to push inland. Over the following weeks, LSTs made repeated trips across the Channel, building up the massive logistical base needed to sustain operations in France. The Normandy invasion would not have been possible without the LST. No other vessel could have delivered armor and heavy equipment in the quantities needed directly onto hostile beaches. In the Pacific theater, LSTs proved equally vital. The island-hopping campaign required landing forces on hostile beaches across thousands of miles of ocean. LSTs made this possible by serving as both cargo vessels and assault ships. They could cross vast distances under their own power, then drive directly onto coral beaches to unload. At Tarawa in November 1943, LSTs landed tanks that provided critical fire support for Marines pinned down on the beaches. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, LSTs delivered tanks, artillery, and supplies despite heavy Japanese fire. Some LSTs were converted into specialized roles. LST hospitals carried medical facilities and treated wounded evacuated from beaches. LST repair ships carried machine shops and could perform maintenance on damaged vehicles. Some LSTs were fitted with additional radio equipment and served as fighter direction ships, coordinating air support during amphibious assaults. The versatility of the basic platform allowed rapid modification for specialized missions. The casualty rate among LST crews was significant but not catastrophic. The ships were large, slow-moving targets during beach approaches, and they carried volatile cargo. Hits from artillery or aerial bombs could cause massive secondary explosions as fuel and ammunition detonated. Despite this, the majority of LSTs survived the war, testimony to both their structural resilience and the skill of their crews. The vessels could absorb surprising amounts of damage and remain operational. Photographs from the Pacific show LSTs with shell holes patched, superstructure damaged, and paint burned away, still making repeated trips to hostile beaches. If you are finding value in understanding the logistics that made victory possible, sharing this story helps more than you know. The LST was not a glamorous vessel, but it was absolutely essential to Allied victory in both Europe and the Pacific. The LST fundamentally changed amphibious warfare doctrine. Before the LST, landing operations required capturing a port or using improvised facilities to bring armor ashore. This meant that defenders knew where attacks would come and could concentrate forces accordingly. The LST made any beach a potential landing site. Armor could be landed on open coastlines, outflanking defensive positions and forcing defenders to spread their forces over vast areas. This flexibility was a force multiplier that offset significant portions of defensive advantage. The production numbers tell the story of the LST's importance. Over 1,000 LSTs were built during World War II, more than any other type of major amphibious vessel. They carried millions of tons of cargo to hostile shores and participated in every major Allied amphibious operation after 1943. The design proved so successful that it remained in service for decades. After the war, LSTs saw combat in Korea, Vietnam, and numerous smaller conflicts. Some vessels built during World War II remained in service into the 1990s, a 50-year service life that speaks to the soundness of the basic design. Modern amphibious assault ships are direct descendants of the LST. The dock landing ships and amphibious transport docks used by contemporary navies incorporate many features pioneered by the LST, including bow or stern ramps, ballast systems for beaching and retracting, and large open cargo decks. The fundamental concept that armor must be delivered directly to hostile beaches to support assault forces remains central to amphibious warfare doctrine. Comparing the LST to other landing craft highlights its unique role. The Landing Craft Infantry, or LCI, could carry 200 troops but no vehicles. The Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP, the famous Higgins boat, could carry 36 troops or a single vehicle, but had to be launched from larger ships. Only the LST combined ocean-going range, heavy cargo capacity, and the ability to drive directly onto beaches. It filled a capability gap that no other vessel could address, and it did so at a scale that made large amphibious operations possible. The LST's legacy extends beyond military applications. The bow door and ramp design influenced post-war development of roll-on, roll-off cargo ships that revolutionized commercial shipping. The ability to drive cargo directly on and off vessels without using cranes dramatically reduced port turnaround times and made containerization practical. The techniques developed for mass-producing LSTs during the war influenced commercial shipbuilding practices for decades. The welded construction methods and prefabricated sections pioneered for LST production became standard in the shipbuilding industry. In some ways, the LST was more important for what it enabled than for what it was. The vessel itself was ungainly, uncomfortable, and marginally seaworthy. But it made possible the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Japan. It turned hostile beaches into viable landing sites and the ocean into a highway for armor. It demonstrated that engineering solutions to military problems need not be elegant or sophisticated. They just need to work reliably at scale under combat conditions. The LST crews who manned these vessels rarely received the recognition given to more glamorous branches of service. They were not fighter pilots or submarine commanders. They drove flat-bottomed ships across hostile waters to beaches where they would become sitting targets for minutes or hours while unloading cargo. They did this repeatedly, often under fire, knowing that a single hit in the wrong place could turn their ship into a fireball. Their contribution was absolutely essential to victory, and the humble LST they crewed became one of the most important weapons of the war. The American tank ship did not turn the sea into a highway through technological sophistication or revolutionary innovation. It did so through practical design, mass production, and the willingness of crews to drive these ungainly vessels into harm's way time and again. The LST proved that sometimes the most important weapons are not the most advanced or powerful, but simply the ones that solve a critical problem that nothing else can address. In the catalog of World War II weapons, the LST stands as one of the most influential, not for destroying the enemy, but for delivering the means to victory directly onto hostile shores.